In the quiet town of Elmridge, the Thornton family name carried weight. Not because they were royalty or held political sway, but because Henry Thornton, the family patriarch, had built an empire from nothing. A self-made man, he turned a rundown lumber mill into a thriving business empire, and in the process, raised 3 children with his late wife. Simon, the eldest and most responsible; Claire, the ambitious middle child; and Noah, the youngest, whose charm often covered his lack of direction. Henry was a man of structure. He kept detailed ledgers, maintained daily routines, and made it known that his estate would be passed on fairly. His children grew up believing that their futures were secured by the fruits of their father's labor. But when Henry passed away at the age of 86, everything they thought they knew unraveled with the unsealing of a single document: the will. The family gathered in the paneled study of the Thornton estate, where the family lawyer, a somber man named Gerald Whitmore, read the contents aloud. There were the usual bequests, donations to charities, token gifts to distant relatives, and a trust fund for the housekeeper's grandchildren. But then came the shock. The bulk of the estate, including control of the business, the family home, and financial assets, had been left solely to Claire. Not Simon, the eldest, who had worked side by side with Henry for 2 decades. Not Noah, who, despite his floundering, had never been disowned. But Claire, who had left the business years ago to chase a political career in another state. The room chilled, though the fire still crackled in the hearth. No one spoke at first, not even Claire. Simon's expression collapsed into disbelief, while Noah stared blankly, as if unable to comprehend what he'd heard. Claire looked down, her face unreadable, as if she too had just heard the news for the first time. Behind closed doors, accusations started to form. Rumors of manipulation, whispered conversations, and secret visits to their father in his final weeks began circulating. Simon, meticulous and level-headed, began investigating. He sifted through old emails, appointment logs, and documents. What he found disturbed him. A series of unsent drafts on Henry's computer, suggesting he had intended to split the estate equally. Notes scribbled in the margins hinted at hesitation, pressure, and confusion. One line in particular stood out. Claire insists again, says it's for the best. Not sure anymore. Simon began to suspect that the will had been changed under duress. Henry, though sharp for his age, had grown frail in his final year. His health had deteriorated rapidly, and though his mind remained intact for the most part, there were gaps, moments of forgetfulness and disorientation. Claire had visited frequently during that time, often without informing her brothers. To Simon, it all added up: a revised will, secret visits, and the sudden shift in inheritance all pointed toward a betrayal buried beneath legal jargon and notarized documents. But proving it would be another matter entirely. Gerald, the family lawyer, insisted the will was legitimate. Henry had been lucid when he signed it, surrounded by witnesses and legal formality. Still, something gnawed at Simon. A father who had raised his children with such fairness wouldn't abandon 2 of them in his final wishes, unless something or someone had influenced him. He couldn't shake the image of Claire standing there, stone-faced, as the will was read. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't shock. It was composure, too calm for someone allegedly caught off guard. And so, the first cracks in the Thornton legacy began to split wide open, not from financial ruin or scandalous behavior, but from something far more insidious: the erosion of trust within blood. The house that Henry built stood tall and proud, but inside, the foundations had begun to rot. The inheritance had not just passed hands, it had detonated the very idea of family. In the weeks that followed the reading of the will, the Thornton estate became a battleground cloaked in civility. Claire took immediate control of the business, stepping into a role she had abandoned years before. She moved back into the family home, citing the need to honor their father's legacy. But the warmth that had once filled the manor turned cold, as tension brewed beneath every interaction. The dining room, once a place of laughter and stories, now echoed with silence and suspicion. Simon kept to himself, retreating into paperwork and private meetings with lawyers. He combed through every record he could access, trying to find legal grounds to contest the will. He wasn't driven by greed. He already had a successful life of his own. But the injustice of it all unsettled him deeply. Their father had promised fairness, yet the final decision betrayed that principle. The more Simon uncovered, the more convinced he became that Claire had orchestrated everything. Noah, meanwhile, descended into quiet bitterness. Once the carefree sibling who floated through life with charm and ease, he now nursed his bruised pride with long nights at the local bar. He felt discarded, like an afterthought in a legacy he'd always assumed included him. Though he had contributed little to the family empire, he had always believed he was part of something larger. Now, that belief had been shattered. Claire, for her part, remained enigmatic. She held meetings, made strategic decisions, and issued reassurances to the board of directors. To the outside world, she was a composed leader stepping up in a time of need. But inside the family, her motives were questioned at every turn. She never addressed the inheritance directly, instead brushing off concerns with vague references to their father's wishes. One afternoon, Simon discovered a recording tucked away in an old laptop their father had stopped using. The file was dated just weeks before Henry's death. In it, his voice sounded frail but determined. He spoke of feeling uncertain, of pressure, of his children growing distant. He expressed love for all of them, but also fear that his legacy would divide them. Near the end of the recording, he paused before saying, "Claire says she'll take care of everything. Maybe that's what I should let her do." The recording wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to reignite Simon's resolve. He took it to his attorney, hoping to at least initiate an inquiry into Henry's state of mind at the time of the will's revision. The legal team warned him of the uphill battle. Without clear evidence of coercion or mental incompetence, the courts were unlikely to overturn a formal document signed with witnesses. As the legal wheels turned slowly, emotional damage spread faster. Noah confronted Claire privately, demanding answers, but returned angrier and more defeated. Whatever was said between them stayed behind closed doors, but the damage lingered in Noah's silence. Simon, once the brother who had held the family together during difficult years, now found himself isolated from both siblings, caught in a storm he didn't start but couldn't walk away from. Thanksgiving arrived, and with it, the first major holiday without Henry. The family had always gathered in Elmridge, but that year, the tradition died along with their unity. Claire invited neither brother. Simon stayed in the city with his wife and children, quietly grieving the fracture. Noah ignored the day entirely, spending it alone with a bottle and fading memories. In that silence, the truth settled like dust across the family portraits that lined the Thornton hallway. The betrayal wasn't just in who got what. It was in what was lost. Trust, connection, and the shared story they had always believed was stronger than wealth. The inheritance had become a symbol of something far darker, that when blood is tested by money, not all ties hold. Some unravel quietly, others tear with a vengeance. Months passed, but the wounds in the Thornton family never closed. The house in Elmridge, now Claire's domain, sat like a monument to a family no longer whole. From the outside, it remained pristine, gardens manicured, windows spotless, lights glowing warmly at dusk. But inside, the emptiness lingered, not just in the absence of Henry's booming voice or familiar footsteps, but in something deeper. The absence of shared purpose, of love without conditions. Claire kept working, her grip on the business tightening. She implemented new policies, cut ties with some of her father's long-trusted advisors, and brought in consultants who praised her for modernizing the company. She smiled in public, posed for articles celebrating her leadership, and delivered speeches about preserving her father's legacy. But each success felt hollow. The praise never replaced the silence of her brothers. The wealth couldn't buy back their trust. She had everything Henry left behind, except the family name that once meant something. Simon's legal challenge eventually stalled. The court ruled that the will was valid and binding. The recording, while emotionally compelling, failed to meet the burden of proof required to nullify a legal document. There was no clear evidence of coercion, and Henry had passed all necessary evaluations of mental competence before the signing. The fight ended not with a declaration, but a dismissal. Simon walked away with nothing but frustration and clarity. He would never get back what he lost. Noah, untethered from any sense of place or purpose, drifted farther into the shadows. He sold off what little he owned, disappeared from social gatherings, and stopped responding to messages. The last anyone heard, he was living out of a rented trailer near the coast, surviving on odd jobs and fading optimism. He had once believed the family name would carry him, but now it felt like a burden he couldn't escape. Back in Elmridge, Claire sat alone one evening in her father's study, surrounded by reminders of a man who had once ruled the room with presence and wisdom. She picked up one of Henry's old journals and began flipping through the pages. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, sometimes drifting into margin notes and lists. In between business strategies and reflections on the company's growth, Claire found occasional personal entries. One dated 5 years before his death stood out. "I worry that I've built a fortress, not a home. The kids are strong, but distant. I thought money would bring them security. I never imagined it would make them strangers to each other." It hit harder than she expected. Claire had convinced herself that she was honoring Henry's wishes, preserving what he built, and protecting the future. But the truth was more complicated. She hadn't saved the family legacy. She had inherited its ashes. The will might have given her everything on paper, but the cost was steeper than she had ever imagined. She had won control, yes, but lost the only people who made any of it matter. There would be no reconciliation, no grand moment of forgiveness or reunion. The bonds had frayed too far, the silence had lasted too long, and the damage had taken root in places too deep to reach. The inheritance had not just reshaped their fortunes, it had rewritten their identities. They were no longer siblings, but strangers bound by a shared history none of them could change. The Thornton name would live on, engraved on buildings, etched into letterheads, printed beneath polished titles. But it would no longer carry the weight of family, only the memory of what once was, and the echo of choices made in shadows. In the end, blood had been thicker than water, but not thicker than greed. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.